Stop for 20 seconds and think about this. What if one of the strangest archaeological patterns in American history was never fully disproved, only buried under ridicule, bureaucracy, and time? What if the real mystery is not whether giants existed, but why hundreds of reports describing enormous human skeletons appeared in mainstream newspapers for decades, and then seemed to vanish from history almost all at once? If this kind of hidden history investigation pulls you in, subscribe now and stay with me to the end. Because the deeper you go into the newspaper archive, the harder it becomes to believe this was all just random error. Not because every report must be true, but because the pattern itself refuses to disappear. I was not looking for giants when I stumbled into this. I was researching 19th century archaeology, the period before modern institutions fully tightened their grip on what counted as legitimate discovery, before professional gatekeepers standardized which questions were respectable and which were dangerous. I was looking at early mound excavations, frontier-era digs, county reports, forgotten clippings from local papers, the kind of material that survives on brittle microfilm and in dusty historical society folders long after official history has smoothed the rough edges away. It began as normal archival work, the sort of research you do when you want to understand how Americans once interpreted the land beneath their feet before the textbooks settled into place. Then the pattern started to emerge. At first it was only a few clippings. A skeleton of extraordinary size uncovered during roadwork. Another discovered in a burial mound. Another exposed by river erosion after a spring flood. Another found by farmers digging a well. Strange, but easy to dismiss in isolation. Newspapers exaggerate. Reporters misunderstand. Local stories grow in the telling. But then a few clippings became dozens. Dozens became hundreds. And what unsettled me was not just the number. It was the tone. These reports were rarely written like fantasy. They were written like documentation. A giant human skeleton had been discovered. The bones were measured. The skull was described. Artifacts were noted. Witnesses were named. The remains were often said to be sent away for examination. The articles sat in the paper beside stories about grain prices, rail schedules, elections, court hearings, and church socials. That ordinary placement mattered. It meant the reporters were not presenting these finds as impossible. They were presenting them as unusual, yes, but still within the range of things a reader was expected to believe. One of the most famous examples is the 4th of May 1912 New York Times report about skeletal remains found near Delavan Lake in Wisconsin, on what later retellings often call the Lake Lawn site. The article described 18 skeletons with unusually large skulls, and over time the story became one of the cornerstone references in giant skeleton lore. Yet modern Wisconsin archaeologists say there is no verified evidence that giant human skeletons were actually found there, and they argue later retellings sensationalized secondhand reports into something much larger than the original evidence supported. But that only deepens the central unease, because even if one famous case was inflated, the archive does not contain only one case. Across the second half of the 19th century and into the early 20th, mainstream newspapers in different states repeatedly published accounts of oversized human remains found in mounds, caves, embankments, and construction sites. Ohio, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Indiana, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, the Ohio Valley, the Mississippi Basin, the Great Lakes region. Again and again, the reports clustered in the very landscapes most associated with ancient earthworks and burial mounds. Landscapes that were being disturbed at scale by farming, railroad construction, flood erosion, and amateur excavation. So I started to imagine the archive not as a pile of strange stories, but as a map. And once you begin mapping it, the old dismissals start to feel thin. Not impossible, but thin. The standard explanation says 19th century Americans often mistook animal bones for human remains, that they exaggerated, that they sensationalized, that they lacked the osteological training needed to identify what they had found. There is truth in that. Archaeologists today point out that giant bone stories were sometimes debunked even in their own era, and that newspapers helped spread hoaxes long before the internet made that easier. Ohio archaeologist Brad Lepper has argued that many of these accounts collapsed under scrutiny or were explained by poor anatomy, rumor, or deliberate fraud. Alesh Hrdlicka at the Smithsonian also publicly dismissed giant race claims in the 1930s. But read the reports themselves and you start to understand why the question would not die. Many do not sound like drunken campfire tales. They sound measured. They include exact heights rather than vague astonishment. 7 feet 4 inches, 8 feet 2, 9 feet 1. They mention femurs, jawbones, skull thickness, burial position, associated ornaments, copper objects, stone tools. They describe deliberate interments rather than random scatter. And perhaps most intriguing of all, certain odd anatomical details repeat across newspapers that had no obvious relationship to one another. Large skulls, exceptionally heavy bone, double rows of teeth, human proportions, but magnified beyond accepted norms. Could that still be error? Of course it could. Repetition does not prove truth, but repetition does demand explanation. Why did similar descriptions recur across regions and decades? Why did the reports concentrate where mound excavation was most intense? Why were these stories common enough that neither editors nor readers seemed to treat them as absurd? And why does the phenomenon appear to crest during the exact period when amateur archaeology still flowed freely into the public sphere, only to fade as institutional archaeology tightened control over interpretation? That timeline may be the most unsettling detail of all. From roughly the mid-1800s through the early 1900s, giant skeleton stories appear often enough to form a recognizable category of news. Then, as the 20th century progresses, the category begins to collapse. Not because excavation stops, excavation continues. Mounds continue to be explored. Human remains continue to be recovered, cataloged, studied, and eventually, in many cases, repatriated. The land did not stop giving up bones. What changed was the interpretive framework around those bones. By the early 20th century, anthropology and archaeology were professionalizing fast. Institutions were consolidating authority. Universities, museums, and federal bodies were deciding which narratives were legitimate, which explanations were scientific, and which claims belonged to the embarrassing prehistory of the discipline itself. At almost the same moment, the old newspaper culture of casually reporting giant finds begins to disappear. Correlation is not proof, but the overlap is difficult to ignore. And then there is the Smithsonian. In the mythology surrounding these reports, the Smithsonian becomes almost a character in its own right. Again and again, newspapers claimed unusual remains were sent to Washington for study. That part is not entirely implausible. In the late 19th century, the Smithsonian and related federal ethnological efforts were heavily involved in mound exploration and in collecting Native American remains and funerary materials on a massive scale. Cyrus Thomas's 1894 report on the mound explorations for the Bureau of Ethnology helped reshape scholarly understanding by arguing that the mounds were built by indigenous peoples, not a vanished lost race. And the Smithsonian became central to how that evidence was organized and interpreted. That matters because it means the institution really was receiving enormous quantities of skeletal material from mound contexts. The question is, what happened between collection and memory? Modern viral claims go much farther, alleging that the Smithsonian deliberately destroyed thousands of giant skeletons to protect Orthodox history. That specific claim has been traced by Reuters and the Associated Press to a satirical origin internet hoax, not to documented evidence. So, no, there is no solid proof for the viral version of a giant smashing conspiracy. But strip away the internet hoax and a quieter problem remains. 19th century America did collect human remains aggressively. Vast numbers were removed from mounds, graves, and indigenous sites. Many were poorly documented by modern standards. Some were misidentified, some were sensationalized, some were stored, some were transferred, some were almost certainly lost in the churn of early museum practice. And because that history is messy, colonial, and morally compromised, it leaves space for suspicion. When people discover a long trail of newspaper stories and then fail to find clear specimen trails for the most dramatic cases, the silence feels loaded, even if the explanation is incompetence, sensationalism, or bad record-keeping rather than deliberate suppression. That is the crack where this entire mystery lives. Not necessarily in a secret vault full of 10-foot skeletons, not necessarily in a smoking gun memo ordering bones destroyed, but in the gap between what newspapers said, what collectors claimed, what institutions preserved, and what later generations were told had never been real in the first place. The deeper I imagined moving into that gap, the more the emotional center of the story shifted. It stopped being only about giants. It became about permission. Permission to notice patterns. Permission to ask whether official certainty sometimes arrives before official understanding. Permission to admit that institutions do not merely discover history. They curate it. They prioritize some evidence, dismiss other evidence, and shape public memory not only by what they preserve, but by what they teach people not to take seriously. That does not mean every forbidden question is true. It means forbidden questions are often the most revealing. Look back at the newspaper archive with that in mind and the texture changes. You begin to see not proof of giants, but proof of something equally revealing. That earlier Americans inhabited a wider imaginative and evidentiary world than we do now. They were willing to print things that modern readers have been trained to laugh away before investigation even begins. They had not yet fully absorbed the disciplinary boundaries that separate respectable knowledge from contamination by the absurd. They were gullible sometimes, yes, but they were also less domesticated by consensus. And because of that, the archive preserves a strange intermediate zone between folklore and science, between observation and myth, between empirical reporting and narrative hunger. That zone is where some of the most interesting historical questions live. Not, did every giant story happen exactly as printed? That is too blunt. The better questions are sharper. What did witnesses actually find? How often were oversized claims corrected? And how often were they merely forgotten? How many reports came from copied stories versus independent discoveries? Which cases generated follow-up analysis, and which simply vanished after the first burst of publicity? Why do so many accounts invoke mounds specifically? And why did the public once tolerate these claims as curious possibilities when the modern mind treats them as intellectual contraband? Even the debunkers tell part of the story. When archaeologists say the Delavan report was exaggerated, that matters. When historians show that newspapers of the era spread giant tales for attention, that matters. When Hrdlicka argued that poorly trained observers were fooled by bones, that matters too. But these rebuttals do not erase the cultural pattern. They explain parts of it while leaving the larger social phenomenon intact. For decades, America repeatedly told itself that giant human remains were emerging from its ancient landscapes. Whether that story reflected misread bones, selective embellishment, older folklore, commercial sensationalism, or occasional genuine anomalies, it became a recurring lens through which the nation interpreted the buried past. And maybe that is the real revelation. Maybe the archive is not whispering, giants definitely walked here. Maybe it is whispering something both subtler and more disturbing, that history is not only what happened, it is what institutions can stabilize, what newspapers can normalize, what museums can absorb, what universities can discipline, what later generations can be trained to forget. Once that realization settles in, the giant skeleton reports stop being merely sensational stories from a credulous age. They become a case study in how a civilization manages the boundary between acceptable memory and unacceptable possibility. Think about the emotional rhythm of the original reports. The bones are found, measurements are recorded, the remains are admired, debated, sometimes shipped away. Then the trail ends. No grand conclusion. No decisive study enters public consciousness. No chapter in the school book follows. Just disappearance. That repeated disappearance is what gives the subject its power. Human beings can tolerate uncertainty. What they cannot tolerate is the sense that a door was opened and then quietly closed before anyone could see what was inside. That is why people keep coming back to these clippings. Not simply because they want giants to be real, though some do. Not simply because conspiracies are exciting, though they are. But because the clippings preserve the feeling of an interrupted conversation. A whole category of discovery seems to begin speaking in public, then gets swallowed before it can finish the sentence. And in that silence, imagination rushes to occupy the vacuum. I keep returning to one particular detail. The ordinariness of the reporting. That is what lingers. The matter-of-fact language. The lack of panic. The absence of that modern sneer which says only fools ask these questions. In those columns, people still believed the ground might surprise them. They still believed history had not fully surrendered its secrets to experts. They still believe that what emerged from a mound or a riverbank had the right to challenge whatever theory was currently fashionable. We do not live that way anymore. Now we inherit conclusions before we inherit evidence. We inherit frameworks before we inherit curiosity. We inherit the polished version of the past, cleaned of the newspaper weirdness, cleaned of the dead ends, cleaned of the embarrassing reports, cleaned of the unresolved anomalies, until history feels less like a landscape and more like a museum corridor where the route has already been chosen for us. But the older archive resists that neatness. It keeps coughing up fragments of a stranger republic, one in which giant skeletons could be printed in mainstream newspapers, discussed over breakfast, and then sent off toward institutional darkness. A republic in which ancient mounds were not yet fully domesticated into heritage sites and interpretive plaques, but stood as open wounds in the landscape, places where the buried past could still erupt into public imagination. So where does that leave us? Not with certainty. Certainty is the first casualty in any honest investigation. It leaves us with a harder, more durable thing. A live question. A question shaped by newspapers, mounds, collectors, institutions, and memory. A question that survives both credulity and debunking. What, exactly, did Americans keep finding in those earthworks? And why did the public record once speak so openly about it before later generations learned to look away? Maybe some of the bones were animal. Maybe some were exaggerated by inches that became feet in retelling. Maybe some were hoaxes designed to sell papers. Maybe some were ordinary human remains misread by excited diggers. But even after granting all of that, the archive remains too dense, too geographically patterned, too culturally revealing to wave away with a laugh. Something happened in those reports. Even if it was not giants in the literal sense, it was still a phenomenon worth explaining. A recurring encounter between the American imagination and the buried dead. A clash between local discovery and national authority. A lesson in how evidence enters public life and how it can be made to leave. The mounds are still there. The clippings are still there. The old questions are still there too, waiting in county archives, on microfilm reels, in forgotten columns no textbook bothers to mention. Who were the people described in those reports? What was actually measured, and by whom? Which bones truly reached museums? Which stories unraveled under scrutiny, and which were simply abandoned? Why did the reports rise so visibly, and then seem to collapse into ridicule? And if one entire category of archaeological reporting can be pushed so far out of public memory that most people no longer know it ever existed, what else has been filtered out the same way? That is the part I cannot shake. Not the fantasy of giants alone, but the machinery of forgetting. The speed with which a civilization can decide that a class of testimony is unworthy of attention. The ease with which archives survive while memory dies. The unsettling possibility that the past does not disappear because it was disproved, but because it became inconvenient to keep discussing. The ground holds what it holds. The old newspapers preserve what they preserve. And somewhere between those two things lies the real mystery. Not just of giant skeletons, but of how history is made visible and how it is made to vanish.